Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here tonight for this November 2023 History Cafe with the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. We're happy to have you and thank you all, including those who are tuning in from our YouTube live stream. I'm Sora. I use they, them pronouns, and I work in public programs here at MOHAI. For low or no vision audience members, I am a white and East Asian person with long brown hair, wearing a blue quilted shirt and black pants. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you need a restroom, they're just beyond the deli case in the cafe, so turn left and they'll be there. History Cafe is a series presented in partnership with HistoryLink on the third Wednesday of every month. Hey Kiku, hey Jen. So tonight's schedule of events will have a 1-hour discussion followed by a roughly 30-minute Q&A. And with any conversation on history and communication, it's important to ground in place and acknowledge whose land we're on. Here at MOHAI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this city with lasting impacts. That said, today we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. To introduce tonight's speaker, Danielle Miller has been the Director and Regional Librarian for the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, WTBBL, since 2008. Miller is the Secretary for the Libraries Serving Persons with Print Disabilities Standing Committee of the International Federation of Library Associations and Organizations, and is the past president of the Washington Library Association. Without further ado, please give Danielle a warm welcome.
Thank you, Sora, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm delighted to be able to talk about the library with you tonight. As was mentioned, I'm Danielle Miller, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a short white woman with wavy brown hair, wearing a black dress and a black sweater. And to kick things off, I will start with some photos of our building. This is a building that many of you may recognize. It's very well known in the Seattle area. I often mention where I work and people say, oh, is that building? And then describe it. So on the right side, or I guess my right, is a current picture of the building. And on the opposite side is an old picture of the building. And this opened on August 20th, 1948 as the S.L. Savage Dodge dealership. And it opened to great fanfare. There were dancers, there was a champagne fountain, and I believe there was even a baby alligator in a pond inside the building. And the building is one of the few remaining streamlined modern architecture style buildings in the Seattle area. It was designed by William Bain, an architect with the NBBJ architecture firm, which is still around today. So we really love our building and invite you to visit us at any time. So to start out the history of the library, I think it's important to talk about the beginnings of library services for persons who are blind or visually impaired. And that starts sort of in 1868 with some of the first books for the blind in the US. And those were 8 embossed volumes at the Boston Public Library. And over the next couple years, that grew to 10 volumes and then a few more. I'm afraid I don't know what those 8 volumes were. I checked the Boston Public Library archives and couldn't find the titles. And then over the next 30 years, the Philadelphia Library, New York, Chicago, and Detroit added materials that were embossed or Braille or Moontype or New York Point for their library users. Then in 1897, the Library of Congress, under current Librarian of Congress at the time, John Russell Young, established a reading room for persons who are blind or visually impaired, starting with 500 volumes. And here is a photo of that reading room with some users there. So to start with our origins, and you'll hear me say Watauble frequently. That is how we call ourselves, and it's much shorter than saying Washington Talking Book and Braille Library every time. So Watauble's origins begin in 1906 with the Seattle Public Library. And we were really pretty pioneering at the time because we were one of 3 libraries west of the Mississippi who had Braille volumes or embossed volumes and services for people who were blind. The other 2 were in San Francisco and Portland. And the services were made available through the work of volunteers, primarily women with the Red Cross and the Seattle Junior League. And those were volunteers who produced books in Braille that were made available at the Seattle Public Library. And the service started to grow, and by 1912, there were almost 80 borrowers in the Seattle and greater King County area. And this is a photo of Mrs. Charles W.R. Sargent. She was in charge of the Seattle Junior League volunteers who did the work for the blind. This is a photo from the town crier in 1928. This is just a couple clippings that I liked from the Seattle Times in 1926 and 1930. The one on the left says the Seattle Junior League is manifesting Christmas spirit by presenting books for the blind. And then on the right, it's a little fuzzy, but there are 3 Red Cross volunteers who have passed a training class, and they're using a slate and stylus, which is a very manual way of producing Braille, and they are making Christmas cards for the blind. So producing Braille at the time, and in fact today, is an expensive and not simple process. It was expensive, especially at the time. An example is producing Ben-Hur at the time cost about $15, which would be about $367 today. It was also difficult to have skilled and trained volunteers. In 1929, the Red Cross had 50 potential transcribers, and they interviewed them and were only able to select 10. And training them, the course took about 9 months, which is not abnormal. We have a Braille transcription class we are doing right now, which is almost 9 months. So there's a lot to learn in transcribing Braille. George Bailey was someone who worked at the Seattle Lighthouse for the Blind, and he taught Braille courses at the Seattle Public Library for 20 years. And the Seattle Lighthouse for the Blind is someone that we continue to partner with today, and many of our library patrons are employed there, and they are a great partner of ours. And here there's a photo of Bertha Bowing. She was, of course, William or Bill Bowing's wife. He's the person who started the Bowing Company. And she was a Junior League volunteer producing and also purchasing and donating Braille. So there's a connection there as well. I wanted to just share this photo. This is not a local photo, but this is a photo from 1922 of women producing Braille in New York. And they are using old Hall Braille writers. They're like Braille typewriters. And I just love this image of all of them in their fabulous hats. So close together, just working away, producing Braille for the blind. And I imagine that some of the Junior League women and Red Cross women here were something very similar at the Seattle Public Library doing that. So to give a little bit of history of Braille, to put it in context, I'm sure you've heard of Louis Braille, but just to give a little more background, he was born in Coupvray, France on January 4th, 1809. His father was a harness maker, and Louis was playing in his workshop when he was 3 years old, and he hit himself in the eye with an awl, and he got an infection, and that infection spread to the other eye, and that caused him to go blind. In 1819, at the age of 10, he was sent to the Royal Institute for the Blind in Paris. And he was a student there. In 1821, he was introduced to a system of 12-dot symbols called night writing that was created by Charles Barbier, And it's said primarily that Charles Barbier created the system for the French military to be able to communicate at night in the dark. Though Charles Barbier had said that his intent was also for the blind to be able to use this system, Louis Braille was very interested in it, but he found it cumbersome because with the 12 dots, you couldn't cover one symbol with one finger. It was too big, so it was difficult to read. So he set to work on refining this system and developing a version of his own. So he worked on this for several years, and in 1824, at the age of 15, he had created the 6-dot cell format that we know today. And in the top corner is an image of Louis Braille. A little more history of Braille. In 1854, his Braille system was adopted at the Royal Institute for Blind Youth. That took a long time. It was not immediately accepted. There was a lot of pushback, and there was insistence on using some other forms of embossed writing, but it was finally accepted. Then in 1882, a long time later, the Braille system was adopted in most parts of the world. Then in 1916, Braille was adopted in the United States, though there was an American version and an English version and some variants. And then finally in 1933, there was a formalized universal English code that was accepted. And this is an image of the Royal Institute for Blind Youth. It does look like that. I visited it in 1918. I'm really old. I feel like it sometimes. In 2018, I visited it. And one of those top right-hand corner windows was Louis Braille's room, and that's, in fact, where he passed away. And this is a picture of the Braille alphabet as we have it today, and I do have Braille cards like this that you're welcome to take at the end today. It's a very elegant system, and I want to just reinforce that Braille is a system. It's not a language, and it can be used in many languages, really any language, whether it's a Roman alphabet or a Cyrillic alphabet or an Arabic alphabet, and it can be tailored to use in any form it needs to be. And it's very clever because dots A through J are also used as numbers. So there's a number sign that you can use. You put it in front of an A, and that becomes a 1. You put it in front of an I, that becomes a 9. In front of a J, that's a 0. There's also a capital sign. You put it in front of any letter, and that indicates to the reader that it's a capital. There's also uncontracted Braille, which is a single representation of each Braille cell to each letter. So 1-to-1, like with my last name Miller, that has 6 letters, there would be 6 Braille cells. Or there's contracted Braille, which helps make things smaller because Braille takes up a lot of space. So in contracted Braille, there's 1 cell that represents an ER. So then my name would take up 5 cells instead of 6. So it's really an ingenious system and very widely used and a very important innovation from Louis Braille. So stepping back to Watauble, the program expanded. By 1915, they were loaning 329 books, and there were more borrowers. And so in 1919, they realized they needed to have a librarian for the blind to run this program. And the first librarian they hired was Fanny Reynolds Howley. And I was unable, over actually this whole time that I've worked at the library, I've tried to find a photograph of her, and I've been unable to do so. But I do have her signature down at the bottom from her wedding, her marriage license. So that's the best I've been able to do. But she worked hard, and in 1920, they acquired a list of blind persons in Washington State, and they tried reaching out to everybody, and that jumped their circulation up to 933 volumes. So that made a big difference. And I also have a photo of the old Seattle Public Library building on 4th Avenue here when the streets aren't even paved yet. And then a really significant thing that happened and really brought the library service into being was an act of Congress in 1931 on March 3rd under President Hoover. This is the Pratt-Smoot Act, and this was Representative Ruth Pratt from New York. She was the first woman elected to Congress from New York, and Senator Reed Smoot from Utah. And this act basically said to the Library of Congress, you need to provide library service to the adult blind in the United States. And they got an appropriation of $100,000, which would be about $1.7 million today. And they knew they needed to do this with cooperation throughout the country, not something they could do on their own. So this is what created what is called today the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled, or NLS. And so NLS set out to create a network of cooperating libraries around the country. And in addition to NLS in Washington, D.C., that first year in 1931, there were 18 libraries that joined the network, and Washington was one of those first 18. So we, at the time, also provided library service to Alaska and Montana, and we have been one of the first NLS libraries since then. And these are photos of Pratt and Smoot, and she has a fabulous animal stole around her that I think we wouldn't find very fitting today, but I'm sure was the height of fashion in 1931. So the early collection, when NLS launched, we were in a very good position because Fannie Howley, our librarian, was actually a member of the American Library Association committee to select the materials that would be embossed or turned into Braille to start the collection that would be shared throughout the country. So by September of that year, they had the first batch of books to be sent to the libraries. And those 15 books started the collection, and the first title was Woodrow Wilson's George Washington. Some of the other titles were the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence, and this is a catalog that they had over the first several years, an image of that. And to show you a few more of the books they selected Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, that was 3 volumes of Braille, E.M. Delafield's The Diary of a Provincial Lady, James Adams' The Epic of America, Willa Cather, Shadows on the Rock. They also did some Shakespeare. There was some Rudyard Kipling. They sent 2 copies to the libraries of the books they felt would be more popular, and 1 copy of those they thought would not circulate quite as well. And I don't have the breakdown of what they thought was what, I'm sorry. And then these are just a couple photos of library patrons reading Braille, a man with his dog and a woman with Braille at a table. And I want to just step back a little bit in time because there was work going on in the realm of sound recording and audio. So one of the first advances with audio recording was Edouard Scott de Martinville in France in 1857. He invented the phonautograph, which was a device that wrote sound to paper. And it would make lines that were close enough to the transcription that he could then transcribe that sound into a transcript of a recording of what had been said. So that was sort of the first advance into sound recording. And then, of course, we know of Thomas Edison in 1877 in the United States, who invented the phonograph. It would record and play back anything it heard. And the first thing he recorded was himself saying, "Mary had a little lamb." But what's very interesting is that in the North American Review, a journal in June 1878, he gave a list of the 10 things that he thought would be the best uses of the phonograph. And the second item on the list, he said, phonographic books which will speak to blind people without effort on their part. And that was in 1878. And so that really was the first audiobook. And now so many people listen to audiobooks in their car, at the gym. Everybody's into audiobooks. But our service was the original audiobook. So he foresaw it. And so that's what was happening in 1932. The American Foundation of the Blind, I'll pause for the interpreters. The American Foundation for the Blind was led by Robert Irwin, and he was a graduate of the Washington State School for the Blind in Vancouver in 1901, and also a graduate of the University of Washington in 1906. And he worked with an engineer, Jackson Kleber, to develop a talking book system based on the Vitaphone 33 1/3 technology. And that's significant because at the time, commercial records played at 78 RPMs, and the 33 1/3 being at a slower speed, you could fit more on the record at that slower speed. So there was more space to fit more of a book. So that was very important and gave them the idea that they could really be successful in putting books on records and serving the patrons. So Robert Irwin lobbied Congress to expand the scope of the Pratt-Smoot Act to include audiobooks or a talking book service, because as it was originally written, it just included Braille. At the time, they were moving into the Depression, and Helen Keller thought that this was a luxury and didn't need to happen because there were so many people out of work. But she came around, and in 1935, she supported the creation of the talking book system, and she helped and advocated for funding for this program to start. And the top photo here is Robert Irwin. The one below is Helen Keller with Robert Irwin, and they're listening to a book playing on one of the first talking book players. So in 1935, President Roosevelt did approve this, and he allotted $211,500 to the Works Progress Administration to construct 5,000 talking book machines to be used to play the books that were produced by Library of Congress National Library Service. And then the work stopped in about 1942 because of the war. 1946, the American Foundation for the Blind picked up production and resumed manufacturing the latest model of the talking book player, and Library of Congress NLS purchased 550 of those players that they distributed to the libraries around the country. And then in 1947, Library of Congress purchased 3,500 that were produced commercially, and for the first time, they had an allotment to continue providing machines from their own appropriation. And from that time on, we have always provided playback equipment to our patrons for any books that we provided. During that time period leading up, some patrons had to purchase their own talking book player, and those cost between $35 and $50. So that was a significant outlay for somebody. But like I said, from there on out, we've always provided anything the person needed to read their audiobooks. And this is a photo of a staff person at the American Foundation for the Blind who's building and testing one of the talking book players. And in 1932, Fannie Howley went to the New York Public Library to work for a little while, and Drusilla Dorland came in as the acting head librarian. But 1934, along with the production of the talking book players, they of course needed to be making the talking books. And so that program started, and Herman Meyer was the staff person in charge of that. And Robert Irwin worked with him as well, and they had a little bit of a difference in opinion of the books that should be produced initially. Herman Meyer thought the books really needed to be elevated, and he wanted, again, things like the Declaration of Independence and the Bible and Shakespeare and very lofty things that were on the caliber of the Library of Congress. But Robert Irwin wanted things that he felt the rank and file would rush to read, so very popular works. And they had $10,000 allocated for this program, and they did really kind of find a compromise and produce materials that met both of those desires. So they did have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but they had Wodehouse, they had the Diary of the Provincial Lady, again, this must have been very popular at the time, and they had selections from the Bible and Shakespeare. And this is a photo of a woman with one of the talking book players and a record. And then I just like this photo of these gentlemen all gathered around listening to a book together. And these are just a couple photos from our archives, stacks of records, property of the US government in the boxes that they would be mailed out in, and then an advertisement announcing the availability of the talking book players. And the records and the talking book players were mailed out using something called Free Matter for the Blind. And this is a postal subsidy that we still use today. So there's no cost to the libraries to mail out any of the books or any of the equipment. And there's no cost to the library users to return any of that equipment. So the service has been completely free, and to this day is still a completely free service, including going back and forth in the mail. So the program continued to expand. In 1937, Fannie Howley returned and stayed the librarian until 1952. In 1938, the circulation had increased to 20,000. 1943, the most popular book was War and Peace. And even though that 33 1/3 fit more material, it still was a whopping 119 records for War and Peace, if you can imagine. And think of the mail carrier that had to deliver that. So that's a lot. And this is a photo here. This is in the Fremont branch, where the library had to move because they needed more space. They moved there in 1945. And this is a photo of staff working, packing up the mail going out. And those are all boxes filled with records. So talking books on record that they're preparing to mail out. And that might all be War and Peace in that photo. So who knows? And then just want to point out one of our notable borrowers. In 1949, in January, Ray C. Robinson signed up for service, otherwise known as Ray Charles. And he was living here and playing music at the old Rocking Chair Club in the Central District at the time. And so this is a photo of him and a photo of the old Rocking Chair Club. And then this photo with the handwritten name is from a ledger that we still have at the library that has a lot of interesting handwriting and names in there. But this is one I wanted to point out, one of our notable Braille borrowers. So we still continued to grow and things were humming along, but we needed more space again. In 1950, the library moved to a new Capitol Hill, Seattle Public Library branch, and we're on the ground floor and had a reading room called the Harry Hartman Room. And there are a couple photos here of the building. And one thing to point out, there's a sculpture. It's sort of a bird-shaped wooden sculpture that was at the end of a banister that led you into the space. And that's actually a Dudley Pratt sculpture that we still have at the library. And we are hoping to be able to find a way to get a new pedestal for it and get it out in our public area and let people know we have it so people can come see it. So it's really nice to still have that. So in 1950, we were up to 1,500 patrons, a circulation of about 42,000, 7,000 talking books, 14,000 Braille books, and over 6,000 requests a month. But they were only able to fill about 4,000 of those requests. So there were some grumpy people. And part of that is that the staff had to do everything by hand. They had to write down everything everybody wanted, everything that was checked out, everything everybody was waiting for. So it was a very laborious process. But they were doing their best and they were getting busier all the time. In 1952, the rules changed and the service was extended beyond just the adult blind to include children. And this is a photo of one of our library patrons, Alco, with her brother Lorne, and they're looking at a new World Book Encyclopedia. Alco is still one of our patrons. She's still a Braille reader. She's on our advisory council, and she actually teaches Braille at the Lighthouse in Spokane. So great to still have her around. In 1962, records were redesigned to play at 16 2/3 RPM, which halved the size of the books, which meant fewer records. They were able to save more money, and so they were able to add more books to the collection and also start a magazine program. So reducing that speed allowed them to actually add more services. Later developments actually got down to 8 1/3 on FlexiDisc, and then the record service finally ended completely in 2001. In 1967, the service extended to include people with a physical disability that makes reading standard print difficult. So that could be neuropathy, Parkinson's, cerebral palsy. We also provide service to people with dementia, traumatic brain injury, and services now include anyone with a reading disability. So the most common might be dyslexia. So it's a very broad category of people that we provide services to. Really, anyone that has difficulty reading standard print is eligible to use our library services. In 1968, Montana transferred services. They opened their own talking book library. And in 1969, talking book service started on cassette tape. So that was a transition. And in the early 70s, there were several different types of cassette players each year. So there was a lot of variety there. But these cassette tapes were predominantly 4-track cassettes to fit as much as possible there and reduce the number of cassettes that were needed for the books. This is a patron with a cassette player and some cassettes. Here are just a sampling of some of the photos we have. A woman with a record player, some of the cassette players and record players, a narrator, a boy with his dog and a record player, and I guess I stuck that Fremont record photo in there again. And then continued growth. In 1970, there were over 3,000 borrowers. 1971 was significant for one of the cassette players introduced. That was what was called the C1. It's the photograph here, this sort of mustard yellow cassette player. Some of you may have seen that before. Maybe a family member or a parent or a grandparent had that. This was the workhorse cassette player that we had around until about 2009. And boy, could they take a beating. And they're still turning up in thrift stores and all over the place. So these were really the workhorse. In 1973, the service had continued to expand enough that they had to move again to a bigger space, and the library moved to the King County Service Center on Harrison Street, which was the former home of a UPS facility. In 1973, there was a radio reading service established, and this was broadcast on the subfrequencies of local radio stations, and radio receivers with SCA frequencies were loaned out to patrons. And the news was read on the radio, and also short stories and book excerpts. In 1973, Alaska established a sub-regional library, and then in 1976 became a regional library. So by the end of 1976, we were just serving Washington. And so now we serve all of Washington by mail, by download, but the whole state, but only Washington. So 1975, funding for the library shifted to the Washington State Library. So we still were administered by the Seattle Public Library, but this was by a contract. So the state library paid for the service, paid Seattle Public Library to run it. So that was a slight difference in how things were funded, but still operated by Seattle Public Library. In 1975, Braille and audiobook production services were added. So at the library, they started producing Braille and audiobooks to supplement the national collection that was provided by the National Library Service. So there's one shared collection between all of the libraries around the country, and now there are 55. There's one in every state. There are 2 in New York and 2 in California. There's one in the Virgin Islands, one in Puerto Rico. There's a sub-regional in Guam. And then if someone lives outside the United States, they get their service directly from Washington, D.C. And we all have this shared collection from the National Library Service. But we want to add more books to it because people with print disabilities, especially people who are blind or visually impaired, have access only to about 7 to 10% of the printed published material that you or I might have access to. So that's not enough. We want to add more and increase access. So we focus on materials that are about the Northwest, set in the Northwest, or by Northwest authors. So that production started in 1975. In 1977, the radio service became the Radio Reading Service by name, and then in 1983 was renamed the Evergreen Radio Reading Service. In 1979, Jan Ames became the director, and she was the director until 2002. And that's just a photo of some of the old Radio Reading Service equipment. Couple photos here, both of the radio control room, an old radio staff person there. The old books were produced on reel-to-reel, as was the radio recordings that were saved. And then the black and white photo is in the audiobook production room that looks quite a bit different now. And again, there was a need to move because the service just kept expanding. In 1983, we moved into our current building, and that was with the help of the National Guard, and that was quite a big move. And this is a photo of the National Guard vehicles on Lenora, and the skyline looks quite a bit different than it does now. There are no Amazon spheres. There are quite a few fewer condominium buildings around there. 1985 was very significant because the circulation was automated, and adaptive and assistive equipment allowed blind staff to use the equipment and be more fully engaged in working in the service. And that automation allowed the staff to really fulfill requests and keep track of what people wanted and provide much better customer service. And also in 1985, the Braille program was revitalized, hiring 2 new staff members and really ramping that up. In 1986, a formal children's program was established, and today we have an amazing, robust children's program with a great youth librarian. We do a summer reading program, a pen pal program. We have an assistive gaming lab. We have Braille literacy, early literacy. We do a multisensory story time, all sorts of stuff. Very engaged with teachers, teachers of the visually impaired, families, the School for the Blind, and all sorts of programming. And in 1999, Web Braille service was available from NLS, and this is electronic Braille that was on an NLS website that patrons could download and use on a refreshable Braille display or have embossed or printed. 2008, in April, I started, and part of this was to lead the transition that became effective on July 1st to direct administration with the Washington State Library. So at that point, we were no longer affiliated with Seattle Public Library at all. And there was a lot of work there, a lot of transition. Many things had to happen, but since July 1st, we have been just a program of the Washington State Library, and of course a regional library of the National Library Service. And this is a photo of one of our youth programs down on the bottom, and one of our former librarians helping a patron use a refreshable Braille display and embossed material in our patron computer lab. In 2009, we received our first digital talking book players. These replaced the cassette books. And by law, veterans have first priority for our services. So another staff person and I went to the home of 2 veterans to deliver the first digital talking book players in Washington. This is one of our former veterans, Mary Tift. She was a wave, and she was delighted with the player, and she's just sort of laughing with joy, hearing it talk to her and hearing it play and the great sound that it had. So that was a really fun day. And we still have that player now. We'll be getting a new player in the next year or so that has wireless capacity and some other features, but this is still our player that we loan today. In 2009, we created a website where we made our locally produced audiobooks available for download, and we were the first library in the NLS network to offer this service. Also in 2009, the NLS Braille and Audio Reading Download, or BARD, website formally launched after a 2-year pilot phase. And this is where patrons could download books to play on a flash drive on the player or on a number of commercial devices like the Victor Stream and a few other devices that they can do that on. And then in 2012, Braille books, including books transcribed by us, became available on BARD, and those are electronic Braille books as well. In 2013, NLS created a BARD mobile app for iOS devices, and then the Android version debuted in 2015. So then patrons could directly download the books to their mobile app, electronic Braille or audiobooks, and this has been incredibly popular, and it's really been a game changer for our service. In 2014, we shipped our 1 millionth talking book on cartridge. It was Dancing to the Concertina's Tune by Jan Walker. That's some of the staff from the shipping department posing with covers of the book and a stack of books behind them. In 2014, we were able to post our first locally produced audiobook on BARD. That was The Alpine Journey by Mary Dayheim. Since then, we've been posting all of our books on BARD, so we no longer have our local download site. The great thing about putting our local books on BARD is they are available not only to Washington patrons, but to all the NLS patrons throughout the rest of the country. In 2019, the United States ratified on the Marrakesh Treaty. The Marrakesh Treaty is a treaty that was signed in 2013 in Marrakesh, Morocco. This is a treaty through the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, and it's an international copyright agreement that allows for the sharing of materials in accessible formats across international borders, as long as the countries have ratified and implemented the treaty, and as long as the materials only go to people with print disabilities. And this is a huge, huge deal because it helps end the global book famine for people with print disabilities and gives us access to so many more materials in languages other than English, and also makes our materials available to people in other countries who want to read materials in English. So it's another way that's increasing access to materials in accessible formats. And at this point, over 100 countries have ratified on the treaty, and we're working hard to help other countries get to that point. In 2021, we switched the way we do our circulation to something called duplication on demand, and this allows for complete customization of orders. So our entire collection is available locally on a computer that speaks to BARD and updates all of the time. So books are available locally. We have cartridges that we duplicate people's customized orders, so they can ask for all of a series on a cartridge. They can ask for books by a specific author. They can ask for anything they want, and there's never any waiting. You don't have to do a hold. You don't have to make a request for something and wait for it. We can give you whatever you want right away. And there's also really no loan period. And with books on BARD, they never expire. There's no, you don't even have to return them. You can keep them as long as you want. It's fabulous. You can just get whatever you want. Our service is really meant to work the way it needs to for an individual, and that's one of the things that's great about it. In 2022, we started loaning refreshable Braille displays, which allow people to download and read Braille electronically, or we can send them Braille books on a cartridge. And I brought a refreshable Braille display with me. If anyone wants to see one afterwards, I'd be happy to show you. And in 2023, we've started adding a podcasting program to our audio department, and we're really excited about launching that, and lots of programs coming up soon. And this is a photo of our duplication on demand station and one of the staff creating all the customized patron audiobook orders. This is just a few photos of our patrons. This is one of our patrons, Zoila, using the Bard mobile app. And one of our narrators, she is actually recording the state voters pamphlet. We produce that in audio so that people are actively able to participate in democracy. And then down below is one of our Braille proofreading teams helping produce our local Braille. And then two of our youth patrons playing with giant Jenga in one of our youth programs. And then we have had some recognition over the years. There have been lots of little things, but a couple of the bigger ones. We've been recognized as the National Library Service Network Library of the Year in 2009, 2016, and 2022, and we are the only network library to receive that recognition 3 times. We also received a mayoral proclamation in 2012 for our work empowering individuals with disabilities, and these are photos of the 2016 celebration at the Library of Congress for Network Library of the Year. And this is me with the former NLS director, Karen Kenninger, and with Cindy Aden, the former state librarian, and of course, Pramila Jayapal, who came and spoke about the library. And we always love to have people come and visit. We'd love to have you in person, see the library, and if you think there's anything more to learn, I can always talk about the library. Come and have a tour or get informational material from our website. Riley, our outreach librarian, is here, and she has created great materials and can come do a presentation as well. There's a spot on our website where you can order things. Our website is wtbbl.org. We've got videos about our programs on our homepage. And we also have social media, facebook.com/WTBBL and Instagram.com/_WTBBL_. And we also have some volunteer options. There's a volunteer page on our website you can visit to learn about current opportunities. And these are, again, a few of our amazing volunteers. We couldn't do what we do without them. They make so much of our work possible. And so I just want to thank you for your time. Again, I'm Danielle. My contact information is danielle.miller@sos.wa.gov. And my phone number is 206-615-1588. I'm always happy to talk about the library. And these are a few more pictures, some volunteers packing records, a postal carrier picking up tons of outgoing mail, a gentleman listening to an audiobook, and this is all the current staff at the library. We are a team of 17, but again, aided by lots of volunteer help and support from our donors and the state library. So thank you very much. Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, and then Sora's going to run the mic to
Okay, okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Please give Danielle another round of applause. And if you have any questions, I will run this mic over to you.
So thank you so much. I just think you guys are amazing. It's such an interesting place. I was wondering, I was able to attend your advisory group meetings, and it was a really interesting experience. I learned a ton, and I was wondering how that got started, and like how long it's been around and what you've learned from it.
The Patron Advisory Council?
Yes. that
Yeah,
one,
so we do have a Patron Advisory Council. It's made up of 15 library patrons that represent all of the types of disabilities that qualify for service. And it's one of the things that is recommended in the NLS standards and guidelines for service. So it's recommended that you have an advisory council, and it was started when Jan Ames was the director, and I'm not sure what year she started it. So I'm not sure the year, but it's been going strong since I started. And some of the things that have been really valuable, there were times that we were in pretty dire budget straits, especially 2009, 2008, 9, 10, when the economy was really bad. And there were a couple times that the legislature had strange ideas about where maybe we should be moved. Maybe we'd fit better in this strange department. And so the Patron Advisory Council has been really important in terms of advocacy and helping rally the rest of the patron base, or being able to do advocacy work that I can't really do so much as a state employee, but that they can do. And so that's been really instrumental. And they're also great to help have as partners in outreach, because I can go and talk about the library, or Riley can go and talk about the library, and we know it very much as how the service operates and what we hear anecdotally, or all the experiences I've had with patrons. But having a library user with us who can speak about the service personally is really valuable, and having that teamwork is really helpful. And they can also give feedback to our partners and our friends, as well as the library, that is just really helps move the service forward. Yeah.
Look at that. So I'm actually a user of the system. I've been a user for a little over a year and a half, and I can't even tell you how grateful I am for it. There are books that I would love to listen to. Like, I actually come to MOHAI a lot, and I look at their books, and I go like, oh my gosh, I wonder if that's on the system, and then I look, and it's not there. How is it possible for me to make a request saying, like, I would love to hear this book by this Coast Salish author?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can send a request. You could send a request to me. I mean, you can always do that. That's fine. You can also send a request to our general email, which is wtbbl@sos.wa.gov. And we have a collection development committee, and we look for local books. And this would be a great resource here. And we are really trying to find Indigenous narrators and find more diverse narrators to help us have those authentic voices to produce some local materials like that. And those are the type of things that we want in the collection, and we want to hear about it. It can take a long time to produce an audiobook. To produce an audiobook, depending on the length and the complexity of it, our narrators are amazing. They're fantastic, and they do a lot of training, and they have to pass an audition. But most of them come in once a week, and they spend about 2 hours. Usually the first hour are a little more narrating, and it's difficult work. And then the next part of the session, they do some self-editing. And so if they're coming in once a week and you have a 200-page book, that takes a little while. And then we have reviewers who listen to the audio files with the print book and notice if there's anything, did they not posit a comma? Is there something that was mispronounced? Anything like that. Then the narrator goes back and makes corrections. And then it gets another review by a staff person, and then any last edits that need to be done. And then we do what we call sound sweetening, where we go through and normalize all the audio files to make it sound good together. And then it gets all the markup and metadata, so you can navigate from chapter to chapter or move around at whatever levels are appropriate for the book, and then it gets uploaded. So it can take, depending on the book, 3 months, 6 months, a year. And we have a lot, we have about 500 books in process right now. And we have a cart with probably 100 books waiting to go. So sometimes there are things we have to prioritize. If it's a Seattle Reads book, or it's a summer reading book, or, you know, Washington State Book Award winner and the author's coming, or so it's always kind of this juggling act. But we want to hear about things you want to do, and it may be something we can get a narrator that's going to be perfect for that, and we can, you know, bump it up in the queue. But please send in those requests, and you can send them directly to me or send them to the general email, but we want to hear about them. And that was a longer answer than you probably wanted.
No, actually, that was awesome. I loved all that information.
Okay. And I'm glad you're loving the service.
Oh, such a relief.
That's great to hear.
I have one. There's so much of the presentation that you gave was about the change in technology over time and how quickly those things have changed, especially recently. And I'm wondering what you are seeing coming up in the future, what the next technology leap do you think is going to be for accessible reading?
Yeah, well, there are a few things on the horizon for us. One of the things is the ability for people to use more of their own devices. So pretty soon, Bard will be streamable, so people can use smart speakers. And there's going to be that. And we have a player coming in the future that's going to be very small, and we'll have a voice user interface, so someone can just talk to it and say, you know, Bard, I want, you know, Catcher in the Rye, and it'll be there. Or we can, at the library, we can push books to it. So someone can call and say, I want Catcher in the Rye, and we can go boop, and it's there. So trying to make things simpler that way and more immediate. The Braille displays have been, you know, a great thing, and it's been really nice to be able to circulate those, because that gives parity for readers, because we've always loaned a device to our audio readers, but not our Braille readers. And now we're providing that playback technology to the Braille readers. But one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting to watch is AI. You know, and how that may not be so much with our books, but maybe we'll be going into some text-to-speech, or we'll be adding some ebooks, or seeing how that comes in. But I was just with a colleague, and he was showing me some AI with photo descriptions, and it was amazing. The descriptions of these photos that were AI generated. And so for people who are blind, you know, can take, you know, aim an iPhone and take a photo and then get a description of it. Or you can have AI, you know, recognize faces for you and tell you who's in the room. So this maybe is not for our books, but there's just a lot on the horizon. And just in the recent past, you know, the iPhone has been such a game changer. Having voiceover and being able to have so many apps in one place and not cart around a GPS and a money reader and a color scanner and a this and a that, but it's all in one place. So, yeah.
I was really interested in what we were talking about before we started the program about the future of picture descriptions and of use of Braille to simulate pictures, or to draw a picture. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a Braille display that's coming out pretty soon that is the size of a page, that can use the Braille dots to simulate images on a page. And so that will be very nice. And then there's also work that's being done at the Andrew High School Library, which is the Library for the Blind and Print Disabled in New York, out of the New York Public Library, and they're doing a lot of work using tactile graphics and different methods of producing tactile graphics. And the librarian there, she's kind of coined this phrase, image poverty, for people who are blind or visually impaired, who've really never had access to images and maybe not even thought about that as an option. because they think, well, it's not something that's available to me. And so kind of rethinking that and thinking about using 3D printers or swell form machines or Braille displays or thermoforms or these other things that can make tactile graphics and images in different ways, to start introducing people to the idea that I can have access to images, or I can have a map that I can understand, or I can want to do interior design on my home and get a layout and imagine it, or I can make a greeting card for somebody with a Christmas tree on it and see what that looks like, just kind of opening that up. So I think that's a really interesting area, and kind of turning that on its head, saying, well, yeah, you can, if you're interested, have access to images, and there are ways we can do that. So I think that's really interesting.
Have audiobooks had any effect on borrowing, or how much is borrowed, or have the volume that's borrowed?
Do you mean commercial audiobooks? Because we do have audiobooks.
Oh, like the audiobook app?
You mean Audible?
Audible app.
No, not necessarily, because people have different needs in some ways, and also you have to pay for Audible. And we're a library, which is great. So, and, and people might want to use Audible as well. And so the thing is, for some people, there's the cost, or there's how are you going to use it? How are you going to access it? For some of our patrons, still getting books by mail at home on a device that's simple to use is the easiest way to get the service. Some people are using an iPhone or a mobile device or a commercial device, and they can also manage an app or another program, and so they may want to get Audible as well. But we have a lot of books that are available, but I say use every source for books possible. We also provide some memberships to Bookshare, which is a commercial service that's subscription. So we make that available. I would say, use Libby or Overdrive at your public library too, if you have the ability to do that. I mean, get a book anywhere you can, and I'm all for it. And if we can help you do that or let you know it's available somewhere else, we want to do that. And we also want to add other services. We have a book club. We do programs. We're doing a civic coffee program tomorrow about aging and accessibility. So we're trying to always add value that will be useful to patrons who, are our demographic. What can we add in addition to the book service to supplement and complement that? But I don't think it's decreased it, but yeah.
I have a question. Thank you. This is fascinating. I'm wondering, have you been seeing Braille usage change with the advent of audiobooks becoming so much more available, or is it really two different user bases that it's not impacting that?
Well, that's a sticky wicket question.
Sorry.
No, no, it's a really good question. So Braille for people who are blind or visually impaired, especially from a young age, is really the way that someone is literate in their primary language, because that's how you learn to spell. That's how you learn to use punctuation. That's how you learn to format. That's how you become literate in your primary language. And you can't do that by only using audio. So you need it because, read, read, there, how do you know? And so being a Braille reader is a key to higher paying jobs, to higher education. It opens a lot of doors. Our former Lieutenant Governor, Cyrus Habib, who was one of our patrons, his campaign slogan was "From Braille to Yale," so it's truly literacy. If you have learned to read and write and been literate, and then you lose your vision later in life, maybe you don't need it. Braille can be incredibly useful if you're losing your sight to mark your microwave, or to put a clothing tag, or if you like to play cards, to have Braille playing cards. So knowing some Braille can be very helpful, but you don't need to necessarily learn Braille and all the contractions and read a book. And to your point, it's very hard sometimes to have families or people or teachers advocate for Braille in education because many people think, oh, we don't need it because there's audio, because there's text-to-speech, because there's all of this. And so Braille is not automatically taught unless it gets put in an IEP or an individualized education plan, or unless somebody advocates for it. And there's a real shortage of teachers of the visually impaired and Braille instructors in the state. So a student may not get Braille instruction but once a week. And just imagine if, you know, your child only got taught to read in school once a week. You know, so it's really hard. So you have to really advocate for it. And so that's one of the things we try and do. We host a Braille challenge. You know, we try and circulate all these Braille books and encourage Braille literacy and Braille programming and a Braille summer reading program, and really encourage it because it is really important. And that's one of the nice things with getting the Braille displays. We can send those out. We can try and revitalize the energy and interest in Braille, and maybe it's not so cumbersome, though there's a lot of value in being able to just scan and skim a hard copy Braille book. But it's something that needs a lot of advocacy because people may think it's not necessary, but it really is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Got a mic. You want to ask questions? Okay, go Kiko.
Then, I might just wrap up with a final question, if that's okay. So I'm wondering if you have any tips or suggestions or frustrations that you would pass on to people and to organizations about how they can make their printed material or their text more accessible to people with reading disabilities?
Oh, gosh.
Big question.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I would say one thing that's really simple is use sans serif fonts. I mean, that seems like a easy one, I think. But that's like, don't use Times New Roman. Use a sans serif font. If you're printing something and hanging it up, make it 14-point font or larger, 16 or 18, preferably. If you might have been bored with me describing the images on here, but if you're doing a presentation, say what the images are. Try and describe things. One of the things that happens all the time, this is not exactly what you asked me, but if you're talking to someone who's blind or visually impaired, introduce yourself and say who you are, and when you're finished speaking with them, let them know you're leaving instead of just walking away. That happens a lot. People will just walk away, which is not very polite. But you don't always think about it because you can just walk away from somebody else when you're finished talking. I don't know. I'd have to, I'm sure there are a million. I'll think of a ton on the way home. But I think a simple one is not using fonts with serifs because they bleed together and you can't, it's hard to read. Yeah, and think of good contrast when you're making things, not a lot of clutter. Mm-hmm.
All right, I guess with that, thank you so much, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you.